It was the summer of 2018, one of those brief stretches in Alaska when the snow had retreated to the high peaks and the days seemed to last forever. In Anchorage, shops filled with tourists. Along the coastal highways, fishermen cast lines into icy waters, their silhouettes framed against mountains that rose straight from the sea. For Ryan and Melissa Carter, the season carried a special meaning. They were young, married for just 4 years, and Melissa was 7 months pregnant with their first child. Friends said they were inseparable, the kind of couple that still held hands at the grocery store, still laughed at each other's jokes even when no one else did. Ryan, 33, worked as an electrician. He was practical, dependable, the type of man who could fix a generator with a roll of tape and a pocket knife. Melissa, 29, had once worked as a preschool teacher before stepping away during her pregnancy. She was described as gentle, patient, and endlessly excited to become a mother. They weren't wealthy, but they shared a love of the outdoors. Hiking, fishing, camping. Those were the things that bound them together as much as anything else. Their house was cluttered with tents, fishing rods, and maps with routes traced in pencil. Alaska, with its endless forests and unforgiving mountains, had become their playground. That summer, they planned what they called one last trip before the baby. Melissa was cautious, aware of her pregnancy, but she insisted that camping was what made her feel alive. "It might be our last chance for a while," she told her sister. Ryan agreed, promising they would stay close to trails, avoid dangerous terrain, and keep the trip short. They chose a spot near the Talkeetna Mountains, a few hours' drive from Anchorage. The area was remote, but not uncharted. Hunters and seasoned hikers knew the trails, and small groups of campers sometimes pitched tents near the rivers that cut through the valleys. For Ryan and Melissa, it seemed like the perfect compromise. Wild enough to feel like an adventure, but safe enough to calm worried family members. On June 14th, 2018, they packed their SUV with camping gear, tents, sleeping bags, fishing rods, a cooler full of food. Melissa tucked in a journal she had been keeping throughout her pregnancy, pages filled with notes about cravings, thoughts for the future, and even letters to the baby she hadn't yet met. They stopped at a gas station on the edge of Anchorage just after 9 a.m. The attendant remembered them vividly. Melissa bought bottled water and granola bars. Ryan filled the tank and joked about how much their SUV was guzzling. They seemed happy, relaxed, ordinary. Security cameras captured them one last time as they drove north on the Glen Highway, the SUV's reflection glinting under the pale Alaskan sun. That was the last verified sighting of Ryan and Melissa Carter alive. When they didn't return as scheduled, family members grew worried. At first, it was brushed off. Camping trips in Alaska often ran long. Phone batteries died. Schedules slipped. But by June 20th, 6 days later, Melissa's sister called the authorities. "They wouldn't just stay out there without telling anyone," she said. "Not with Melissa pregnant. Something's wrong." The Anchorage police filed the missing persons report. From there, the nightmare began. Neighbors described the Carters as ordinary, responsible. Friends said they were excited about becoming parents. No one could imagine them simply walking away from their lives. Ryan's boss said, "He was dependable. If he was going to miss work, he would call. He never just didn't show up." Melissa's parents echoed the same. "She was preparing the nursery. She was so excited. She was not the type to disappear." Their SUV, a silver Toyota 4Runner, became the first focus of the search. Within 2 days, troopers spotted it parked near a trailhead in the Talkeetna Mountains. It was locked, neatly packed, no signs of damage. Inside, officers found camping gear missing: a tent, 2 sleeping bags, some cooking supplies. They had taken what they needed for the trip, but nothing more. To searchers, it suggested they had indeed set out camping as planned. But the discovery raised its own troubling question. Why had the vehicle been left untouched for nearly a week without anyone seeing them return? The trailhead was busy in summer, popular with day hikers and hunters. How could 2 people, one of them visibly pregnant, walk into those woods and vanish without leaving a trace. By June 22nd, search teams fanned out across the Talkeetna wilderness. Helicopters circled overhead. Dogs combed the trails. Volunteers from Anchorage joined local troopers, shouting the couple's names into the silence. Nothing came back. No footprints, no torn clothing, no broken branches, no sound. The Carters were gone. That was how it began. An ordinary couple, expecting their first child, heading out for one last camping trip before parenthood. Their SUV still waiting at the trailhead. Their plans simple. Their lives full of hope. And then, nothing. 2 years later, when a hunter stumbled across a discovery deep in the woods, the story took a darker turn. But in 2018, all anyone knew was that a husband and his pregnant wife had walked into the Alaskan forest and simply never walked out. It started with small concerns that felt at first like overreactions. Melissa's sister, Erin, sent 2 texts the night of June 16th and got no reply. She told herself it was nothing bad reception in the mountains, dead batteries. Maybe the 2 of them had fallen asleep early. By the morning of June 17th, she called anyway. Ryan's phone rang twice and went to voicemail. Melissa's went straight to voicemail on the first try. Erin waited until noon, then called again. Nothing. By the end of that day, she had phoned 3 of Ryan's friends, one of Melissa's co-workers from the preschool, and finally their next-door neighbor, who agreed to walk over and knock. The house was quiet. The mail hadn't piled up. 2 coffee mugs sat rinsed upside down in the rack by the sink. In the nursery, a partly assembled crib leaned against the wall. The instruction manual opened to step 6. It looked like any home paused midweek. Only the silence felt wrong. On June 18th, Ryan missed a service call he'd scheduled before the trip, an early morning generator inspection for a small fishing charter on the Kenai. He never missed work without warning. The owner called Ryan twice and then dialed Erin's number from the paperwork. "Something's off," he told her. "Ryan's not the kind of guy to ghost a job." Erin drove to Anchorage that evening and let herself into the Carter's place using the spare key Melissa had given her, just in case. She walked through each room carefully, as if the house could tell her where they had gone. Their passports were in the desk drawer. Melissa's prenatal vitamins were in the kitchen cabinet, 4 doses still in the weekly organizer. On the coffee table lay the printout of their camping plan, a highlighted route to a trailhead north of Palmer, notes in Ryan's handwriting about mileage, a small list of meals: chili, oatmeal, jerky, tea. At the bottom, Melissa had written in looping script, "Back by wed night. Promise." Erin called the Anchorage police just after 9 p.m. An officer took her statement, asked the routine questions, and reminded her that adults are allowed to go off the grid. Erin interrupted him. "She's 7 months pregnant. She wouldn't go missing on purpose." The missing persons entry was filed the morning of June 19th. A trooper out of Palmer drove the Glen Highway to check the trailheads listed on the printout. At the second stop, a gravel lot cut into a stand of spruce and birch, he found a silver Toyota 4Runner with a thin film of dust on the windshield and a parking stub tucked beneath the wiper. The stub, paid with a credit card ending in 4421, was time-stamped June 14th at 12:13 p.m. The doors were locked. The tires were clean, but not fresh fine grit had settled into the treads. Through the glass, the trooper could see an empty rear cargo space where a tent and bags might have been. In the cup holder sat a plastic hospital appointment card, reminding Melissa of a prenatal checkup on June 25th. He radioed in the plate. A minute later, dispatch confirmed the vehicle belonged to Ryan Carter of Anchorage, reported missing the night before. The trooper circled the lot, logged the GPS coordinates, and called for a second unit. They waited for 2 hours before forcing entry, a choice made after APD notified the family and confirmed there were no spare keys. Inside the glove compartment, they found registration and insurance papers, a folded trail map annotated with pencil marks, and a small laminated card listing wilderness, safety basics bear protocol, First aid steps, the number for the local ranger station. In the back were 2 camp chairs, a half-empty box of matches, and a plastic bin labeled kitchen with a camp stove, fuel canister, and a single unused metal mug. Missing were the tent, sleeping bags, and the cook pot. Missing too were the cooler and the food they'd packed that morning, according to the receipts later pulled from their bank statements. A single receipt from a gas station 20 miles south, time-stamped 10:02 a.m. June 14th showed fuel and 2 bottled waters. Security footage from that station, obtained 2 days later, confirmed it. Ryan at the pump, Melissa walking back to the passenger side with a hand pressed to her belly, smiling at something he said off camera. The video captured them driving away northbound, the 4Runner's taillights shrinking into glare. Searchers arrived before dawn on June 20th, volunteers, a K-9 unit from Wasilla, and 2 rangers who knew the drainages and game trails better than any map. They started where most hikers start, the signed trail leaving from the far end of the lot, a path that climbs gently through birch to a low overlook before splitting toward 2 alpine valleys. If Ryan had chosen safety over ambition, as everyone who knew him said he would have taken the easier fork left. The K-9 team moved that way first. Dog work in Alaska can be thankless. Wind shifts, moisture flattens scent. Moose and bear trails crisscross every human route and confuse even the best noses. Twice the lead dog showed interest at the overlook, circling and whining at the edge of the tree line, but both times the handler shook his head. "Old," he said. "Could be anyone." By noon, they had flagged the main intersections with orange tape and started side sweeps in pairs. The ground was soft in the shade where snowmelt had only recently retreated. In those pockets, you can sometimes read a day's traffic like a ledger. They found print slots of them wide tread from boots, narrow bars from trail runners, the occasional impression of a trekking pole basket. None were distinctive. No one could say, definitively, this was Ryan's boot, or this belonged to a woman 7 months pregnant. At the creek crossing, where rounded stones sit slick with algae and the water runs shin-deep in June, a ranger crouched and studied a darker patch on a flat rock where someone had slipped recently. He touched it, looked at his fingers, then stood. "Just moss," he said. The group moved on. That first day ended at 9 p.m., the kind of late light that never fully fades in an Alaskan June. They made a plan for early the next morning. Broaden the grid. Add a helicopter. Request cell phone ping records. Aaron, exhausted, sat on the tailgate of the trooper's SUV and stared at the trailhead sign until the letters blurred. "She would have called me," she said to no one in particular. "If she could have, she would have called." Cell records trickled in on June 21st. Ryan's phone hit a tower east of the trailhead at 1:27 p.m. on the 14th, likely the last gasp of service before the valley swallowed signal. Melissa's phone stopped connecting even earlier, at 12:41 p.m., consistent with being powered down or losing battery as they drove into the hills. There were no pings after that from either phone, no outgoing texts, no calls to 911. The helicopter arrived late the same morning and flew patterns up and down the valley, the pilot banking to give the spotters better angles on possible campsites. From the air, the country looks simple ribbons of green, cut by gray scars where avalanches took trees years before. On the ground, those scars are choked with alder and deadfall, and everything that looks straight on the map is, in reality, a series of detours and compromises. Twice the spotter asked the pilot to hover for a closer look, once over a bright scrap that turned out to be a Mylar chip bag, once over an orange dot that resolved to lichen on stone. On the afternoon of June 22nd, a volunteer team moving upslope from the Eastern Fork found a small flat area sheltered by spruce with signs of use, a circle of stones blackened in the center, a short length of paracord looped between 2 trunks at shoulder height, and an ash bed that broke apart when touched. A campsite. It could have been anyone's, but it was in the kind of place Ryan would have chosen. close to water, out of wind, not too far from the main trail. They photographed everything before bagging what little remained: a torn corner of a grocery bag, a plastic tea wrapper crumpled and wedged under a root. The tea brand matched one on the Carter's grocery receipt from the morning of the 14th. It wasn't proof, but it was the first thread that felt like one. Just below the site, at the creek, a ranger found a piece of nylon cord snagged on a branch over a deep, still pool, the kind of place fish hold. It looked like someone had tied the cord as a quick marker, or maybe to steady themselves crossing. The knot was simple, the kind you make one-handed when you need it to hold for a minute, and don't intend to come back for it. That night, the search boss briefed everyone in the gravel lot. "We have a likely camp," he said. "We have small items that are consistent with what we know. We do not have the Carters. Tomorrow we push further up both forks and into the next basin. Hydrate. Sleep if you can." June 23rd was colder. Fog sat low in the morning and burned off by 10. The dogs worked the perimeters of the camp, cut scent cones across the creek, and ranged ahead. Midday, one of them threw its head up and pulled hard toward a tundra bench dotted with low willow. The handler let the line run and then slowed, scanning. On the ground, half under willow leaves, lay a silver zipper pull. It could have been from any jacket, any pack. The handler dropped it into a bag anyway and marked the GPS point. 20 yards beyond the zipper, they found the print of a boot heel sunk deep into soft earth where the bench gives way to slope. The print had edges sharp enough to suggest it wasn't ancient, but there were no accompanying toes, no partner print to give stride or direction. It was one step, out of context, like a word torn from a sentence. On June 24th, a sudden squall of rain made a mess of everything. The creek rose an inch in an hour and pulled at the banks where the camps had been, smearing tracks and scent alike. The helicopter didn't fly. The team kept at it on the ground, soaked through, calling names into the hush of water and leaf. In the late afternoon, a volunteer slid in the mud and grabbed at a sapling, bringing down with his hand a small scrap of blue fabric. It was nothing, a shred of tarp, probably years old, but for a split second, everyone's breath caught. Erin returned to Anchorage that night to meet with detectives who had questions only she could answer. Did Melissa ever talk about running? No. Did she have enemies? No. Had she seemed depressed? She was nervous, Erin said, but she was excited. She'd been writing letters to the baby in her journal. I can show you. Erin brought the journal from the house. The last entry was dated June 13th. It talked about packing snacks, about how the baby kicked when she drank cold water, about the name choices she and Ryan still debated. 2 girl names, 1 boy name they both liked. She had drawn a small heart under the boy's name. Detectives asked about weapons. Ryan kept bear spray, a folding knife in his pack, and sometimes carried a .357 when they went deep. The pistol was licensed. It wasn't in the house. It wasn't in the SUV. If he'd brought it, it should have been with him. By June 25th, the search had covered the main routes out of the valley, the obvious game trails into the next 2 basins, and dozens of little hollows where a tent might sit hidden from the trail. Nothing. The campsite felt like an answer and a taunt at once. Proof they had been there. Proof they had not simply turned the Forerunner around and driven home. And proof that even with that knowledge, the terrain was big enough to eat the rest of the story. On June 26th, the search shifted strategy. The boss split teams into smaller units and sent them to features that attract people even when they don't mean to be attracted. Waterfalls, rocky outcrops with views, benches of flat ground and seas of steep. A pair working a boulder field heard the clatter of rock and froze. A black bear, unseen until it wasn't, huffed once and turned away, more annoyed than curious. In its wake they found nothing but claw marks on a rotten log and scat studded with berry skins. The last official day of large-scale searching in June ended the way the first had begun, in the gravel lot, with bug spray and maps and a sense that they were missing something important. The coordinator read the same words every coordinator reads at that point. We are not ending. We are scaling. We will continue targeted searches as leads develop. Aaron stared at the dark line of trees and said quietly, "She's still out there." No one corrected her. Summer turned to a string of weekend sweeps, fewer people each time, more locals than troopers, people who knew the country by feel and followed hunches to unmarked places. A prospector scanned the creek bed with a metal detector and turned up only old nails and a rusted spoon. A bush pilot glassed the valleys from a distance on clear evenings and radioed in anything that looked like unnatural color. Every orange he flagged turned out to be fungus or lichen. By August, the file thickened with notes, photographs of places that might matter, inventory lists of objects that probably didn't. The case didn't have the spectacle to hold national attention. No dramatic accident site, no last desperate phone call, no villain you could point a camera at. It was simply two people who had walked into a wilderness they loved and failed to walk back out. That absence is the kind that erodes memory in the public and hollows out the people left behind. The fall brought early snow to the higher benches. The campsite disappeared beneath it, and when a ranger skied past on a patrol in October, he stopped and stood where the stones had circled the fire. He listened to the wind moving through the spruce. He didn't expect to hear anything. He didn't. He took off a glove, pressed his palm briefly to the snow where the ash had been, and then skied on. That winter, Erin boxed the crib parts and slid them into a closet, not because she had given up, she told herself, but because dust made her throat hurt when she walked past. She kept Melissa's journal on the nightstand. Sometimes she read the last entry out loud. Sometimes she put her hand on the cover and just sat, counting the seconds it took for the furnace to kick on, and the same number of seconds after it turned off, like timing could make order out of a story that refused order. The spring thaw brought 3 false leads, and one of those cruel coincidences that look like answers until you touch them. A hiker found a blue beanie tangled in alder and brought it to the post. Erin thought she recognized it from a photo of Melissa the previous winter. The tag inside didn't match the brand Melissa wore. The beanie belonged to no one anyone could name. It joined the spoon and the nails and the zipper pull in a labeled bag in a gray cabinet. By the anniversary, the case file read like weather dates, conditions, a sketch of where the fog had been, of where the sun broke through. The coordinates of the campsite were highlighted. The words "last known" were penciled next to them. There was, even then, no reason to think the story would move again. 2 summers later, it did. A hunter, working a ridge miles from the Carters' camp, saw something white in the leaf litter at the base of a spruce and knelt, thinking antler. What he turned over in his hands was not antler. It was a fractured piece of human skull, clean and light and wrong, in a way that sent him stumbling backward before he could make his fingers dial. The hunter who made the call was a 46-year-old local named Mike Rowan, a man who had spent most of his life in Alaska's interior. He was used to finding the remains of animals in the bush moose bones scattered by wolves, a bear carcass picked clean by scavengers. But he knew instantly this was different. Human bone felt lighter, thinner, more fragile. It carried a wrongness that made his stomach tighten. He marked the spot with orange tape from his pack and walked half a mile back uphill until he had cell reception. His voice shook as he spoke to the dispatcher. "This isn't an animal. You need to send someone now." By dawn the next day, troopers and forensic technicians were on the ridge. They expanded the search outward in careful circles, combing through moss and soil with gloved hands, flagging each find. Within hours, they had collected enough bone fragments to confirm it wasn't an isolated piece. It was a partial skeleton. The remains were scattered, as if disturbed over time by weather or wildlife. A ribcage collapsed inward, long bones pulled apart, a spine half buried in moss. They gathered them gently, piece by piece, into evidence bags. Beside the bones, they found shreds of fabric dark green nylon, the color of the jacket Ryan's sister later confirmed he had worn that summer. Near the base of the spruce, investigators uncovered something more telling: a leather belt, cracked and stiff from weather, still buckled. Attached to it was a sheath, empty, the outline of a blade impressed into the leather. The revolver Ryan was known to carry was nowhere to be found. Dental records confirmed what the fabric and belt suggested. The remains belonged to Ryan Carter. For 2 years, the families had lived in uncertainty, but this confirmation landed like a stone in the chest. Erin collapsed when detectives told her. Melissa's parents wept openly, clutching each other. They had hoped for answers, but this was only half of one. Ryan was dead. Melissa, 7 months pregnant when she vanished, was still missing. The autopsy gave little comfort. The bones bore no clear signs of animal predation beyond scattered marks consistent with scavengers long after death. No bullet holes were identified, though one rib carried a fracture that could have come from blunt force trauma. The skull was too fragmented to determine cause of death. The medical examiner's report concluded simply: remains consistent with exposure and decomposition in wilderness environment. Manner of death: undetermined. The questions only deepened. If Ryan had died there, where was Melissa? If she had perished alongside him, why weren't her remains nearby? If she had survived longer, how had she disappeared without leaving a trace? The ridge where Ryan's body was found lay nearly 6 miles from the couple's suspected campsite. The terrain between was brutal dense brush, sudden gullies, tangles of alder that caught and held clothing. For a heavily pregnant woman to cross it alone was nearly unthinkable. Some speculated Ryan had left camp to hunt or scout and never returned. Others wondered if the couple had been separated, perhaps during a storm or after an encounter with wildlife. But nothing explained the absence of Melissa's body, her clothing, her gear. 2 years of silence ended with one half of the couple found, and the other erased as if she had walked off the face of the earth. The press returned to the story, framing it with stark headlines: remains of missing camper, found in Alaska, wife still missing. Hunter's discovery reignites mystery of vanished couple. Reporters pressed investigators for answers. A trooper spokesman admitted what everyone feared: at this time, we have no evidence to indicate where Melissa Carter is or what became of her. For Erin, it was worse than the first disappearance. I buried my brother-in-law, she said, but my sister is still out there somewhere, and I can't decide if it's worse to think she's gone or worse to think she's alive and we'll never find her. The forest, vast and silent, had given back one body, but it had kept another, and in that gap one life confirmed, another withheld. The darkest theories began to take shape. The recovery team worked slowly, carefully, photographing every angle of the ridge before disturbing it. They marked the bones with small numbered flags, bagged each fragment separately, and swept the soil for anything small enough to have been missed. When the site was cleared, the team carried the evidence down to a waiting helicopter. At the lab in Anchorage, forensic specialists laid the bones out on a table under bright lights. They were fragile from years of exposure, but largely intact. The spine and pelvis were complete enough to determine sex and approximate age. Dental comparison matched Ryan Carter. There was no doubt about his identity. What the bones did not reveal was how he had died. The skull was fractured in several places, but not in a way that clearly indicated violence. One long bone showed a possible stress fracture, but it could have been caused by post-mortem breakage when the body shifted under weather. A rib carried a crack suggestive of blunt force impact, yet equally consistent with the pressure of a fallen branch. Every clue had more than one explanation. The belt and sheath were examined next. The sheath was empty. The leather hardened into the shape of a revolver. Ryan's .357 had been missing since the initial search 2 years earlier. It was never recovered near the body. To some investigators, that was the most suspicious detail. If an animal had killed him, why would the gun be gone? If Melissa had survived after his death, could she have taken it? Or had someone else, unseen, removed it before leaving the body behind? The fragments of green nylon were analyzed and matched to the brand of jacket Ryan had owned, confirmed by old photos provided by his family. They told little beyond placing him there. Soil samples from beneath the skeleton revealed an unsettling timeline. Layers of moss and sediment suggested the body had been relatively undisturbed for at least 18 months. That was consistent with Ryan dying not long after he vanished. But certain marks on the ground, faint depressions where bones had shifted, suggested possible disturbance, maybe by scavengers, or maybe by something else. The location itself troubled investigators. The ridge where Ryan's remains were found was not in line with the couple's intended route. It lay 6 miles from their suspected camp, across treacherous terrain. The path was not one Melissa could have managed heavily pregnant, not without Ryan's help. If he had died there, did she try to follow him? Did she wander in another direction? Or had they been separated before he reached that place? Theories swirled immediately. Some officers leaned toward natural causes. Ryan could have been injured, slipped, broken a leg, succumbed to exposure. Alaska's wilderness takes lives every year, even from the experienced. If Melissa had tried to go for help, perhaps she had been lost or taken by wildlife, leaving no trace. Others were less convinced. The missing revolver gnawed at them. "You don't just misplace a .357 in the bush," one trooper said quietly. "If it's gone, somebody carried it out." That suggested a human hand, either Melissa's or a third party's. Among locals, darker rumors spread. Some believed Ryan had harmed Melissa, then met his own end days later. Others whispered the opposite, that Melissa, under strain, had lashed out. But there was no evidence of conflict at the campsite, no sign of a struggle in the ridge clearing, and those who knew Melissa rejected the notion outright. She was looking forward to being a mother, her sister Erin said. She carried that journal everywhere. She wasn't planning on running. She wasn't planning on hurting anyone. The forensic report was filed in August 2020. Its conclusion was stark in its emptiness. Remains of Ryan Carter recovered. Cause of death, undetermined. No evidence to confirm presence or absence of second subject at site. For Melissa's parents, the words were a blade. "We wanted answers," her father told a reporter. "Instead, we got a pile of maybes. He's gone, but she's still nowhere. And that's worse than knowing she's dead. At least with Ryan, we can put him to rest. With Melissa, we're stuck in the dark." The community of Anchorage and the smaller towns around the Talkeetnas debated the evidence endlessly. Was Ryan's death an accident? Was Melissa's disappearance a second tragedy? Or was there someone else out there who knew the truth? One thing was certain. The discovery had not closed the case. It had cracked it open again, wider than before. The ridge had given back a skeleton, a belt, a sheath, and scraps of fabric. It had not given back Melissa. And in that absence, the mystery only deepened. The announcement that Ryan's remains had been found changed the tempo of the case overnight. For 2 years, the search for the Carters had been a story that slipped in and out of the public's attention. Now it was urgent again and narrower. Investigators stopped asking, "Where are they?" and started asking, "Where is she?" Search planners pulled out the old maps and layered new circles onto them, distance rings, time-based isochrones, terrain penalties. They modeled how far a healthy adult could move in a day across that country, then cut the radius almost in half to account for Melissa's pregnancy. The ridge where Ryan died became the center point. From there, they drew corridors along likely travel lines, watercourses, benches of open ground, old game trails that sometimes serve as the only viable routes through alder-choked slopes. They brought in a fresh K-9 team, trained specifically for human remains detection. Scent work after 2 Alaskan winters is a long shot, but not impossible. frozen ground preserves, summer rot releases. If Melissa had died within a mile or two of Ryan, there was a chance, slim, but real, that trace odor would still sit in shaded pockets where wind didn't scour it clean. Over 3 days, the dogs worked a grid in heat that wavered between drizzle and sun. They alerted twice both times to old, shallow animal burials. Disappointing, but not meaningless. It told planners which gullies held scent and which blew clean. Drones had grown up since 2018. A volunteer group flew thermal-capable units over the basin at sunrise and sunset when the ground's residual heat made anomalies pop. The pilots worked from a meadow below the ridge, calling out coordinates as their screens flickered with shifting gray. They flagged 6 points for ground teams, irregular shapes that might have been tarps, bags, or just rocks warming at odd angles. All 6 were rocks. A helicopter staged from Talkeetna and made methodical passes at low altitude, doors off, spotters leaning into the slipstream with binoculars pressed hard to their faces. From the air, a human outline is often the only thing that looks wrong in a landscape of rightness. They saw moose, a sow with 2 cubs, a fox trotting the line where tundra meets spruce. They did not see Melissa. On day 4, a ranger working the tree line directly below the ridge found something that froze him in place. A single impression in damp earth, narrow at the heel and wide at the toe, with a faint serrated edge on the forefoot where a tread pattern had bitten. It was old enough that the edges had sagged, but preserved enough to read as a boot print from a small foot. He photographed it, cast it, and marked the area for a closer sweep. 10 yards downhill, they found nothing. 20 yards uphill, they found nothing. It remained what so many clues do in wilderness cases, a word without the sentence around it. Detectives widened the lens. If Melissa had left the ridge alive, if, for instance, Ryan had been injured and she'd gone to find help, what were her options? To the south lay the trailheads and the road network that would eventually lead to Palmer and Anchorage. To the north and east lay bigger country, fewer trails, and drainage after drainage of similar-looking valleys. If she'd made the wrong turn early, she could have walked into more of the same more trees, more water, more emptiness, until weather or injury drew a line under the attempt. They revisited the 2018 campsite. The original stone ring was scattered by snow load, but you could still see where someone had strung paracord between trees and where a log had been dragged to make a crude bench. In a stand of spruce 20 yards away, a tech found a tiny metal snap, the kind used on maternity jackets to cinch a panel tight over a belly. The plating had dulled, but the part number on the back matched a model Melissa's sister recognized from a photo taken that spring. Lab work couldn't put it in Melissa's hands, but it could put it in that camp, in that season. The find hardened the sequence the family had always believed. They camped. Something happened. They split or were separated. Ryan died on the ridge. Melissa did not die there. Tips, dormant for months, bloomed again after the press conference. A mushroom forager swore he'd seen a woman moving alone near a creek crossing in the summer of 2018, holding her stomach like she was hurting. He hadn't told anyone then because he assumed she was with a group. He could not point to a map with enough certainty to make it actionable. A pilot thought he remembered a bright scrap near a lake that year, but the lake had ice that summer, and any fabric would have blown out or sunk by now. A man called from Fairbanks and said he'd given a ride to a woman who didn't talk much in August 2018, but his story drifted when detectives pressed for details, and he admitted later he'd mixed up years. The missing revolver troubled everyone. Troopers canvassed pawn shops from Anchorage to Wasilla and scanned ATF traces for any .357 with serial numbers within range of Ryan's. Nothing surfaced. If the gun had been taken as a souvenir, it hadn't been sold locally. If Melissa had carried it, it might still be somewhere on the ground, rusting under moss a mile or 5 from where Ryan died. A line in the evidence log summed it up with clinical brevity. Firearm, not recovered. Melissa's obstetrician sat with detectives to explain, in calm, unflinching terms, what 7 months meant in the field. Walking was possible. Miles per day were possible on trail, hard off it. But the risks fall. Dehydration, preterm labor stacked fast. If she was alone, her window was small, the doctor said. Hours, not days, unless she found shelter and water quickly. The family absorbed all of it, and then met the public halfway. Erin stood in front of 2 microphones on a windy day in Talkeetna and said what she had learned to say. If you were out there in June of 2018, if you hiked, hunted, flew, or fished anywhere near the Talkeetnas, and you saw anything that didn't fit, please call. A scarf, a shoe, a scrap of blue tarp. We don't need a smoking gun. We need a thread. Threads did appear, and most frayed in the hand. A blue baby blanket turned up miles away. Wrong weave, wrong brand. A campsite with a recent fire ring yielded a food wrapper that matched the Carters' preferred tea sold in every store within 100 miles. 2 bone fragments found by ATV riders were mule deer. Behind the scenes, detectives also reopened the thin file on human interference. Not because evidence pointed there, but because evidence didn't point anywhere. And leaving a column untested is how regret is made. They re-interviewed the men who'd been on the mountain. Those days hunters, a pair of prospectors, a solo hiker who had signed the trailhead register but crossed out his route because he was undecided. They pulled his cell records and confirmed he'd been where he said he was. They ran firearms checks on 3 names that had floated in 2018. Clean. They looked at a cluster of burglaries that summer along the Glen, not because burglary connects to homicide cleanly, but because sometimes the kind of person who prowls houses discusses what he's seen elsewhere. No overlap. No useful gossip. When the summer window closed, the search scaled back again, as it always does in Alaska when snow begins to creep low and light shortens. Teams cached coordinates and plans for spring. Check the north-facing shelves that stayed frozen longer. Push another kilometer down the drainage that carried the most debris after storms. Bring a side-scan sonar for the beaver ponds that might hold heavier items sunk in silt. Before the last helicopter lifted, a trooper walked the ridge one more time and stood where Ryan had come to rest. He said later that the thing that gets people from outside wrong about cases like this is the scale. On a map, 6 miles is a line. In the Talkeetnas, 6 miles is a day and a half of decisions, any one of which can tilt the story towards survival or loss. You imagine a straight line, he said, but out here there aren't any. By then, the file had a new cover sheet. Carter, Melissa, enduring missing. It's a bureaucratic phrase for a human fact. Ryan had been found. Melissa had not. The ridge had given its answer. The valley still held its own. In Anchorage, Erin kept the journal on the nightstand and sometimes opened it to the page with the names. She traced the one with the small heart beneath it and thought about what it means to carry 2 futures into a place built for none. When reporters called, she said the same thing every time because it was the only true thing left to say. If she's gone, I want to bring her home. If she isn't, I want her to know I haven't stopped looking. The second discovery. Ryan's skeleton reframed the case, but left investigators stranded in the same absence. They had half a story, half a family, and none of the connective tissue that would explain why a man's body ended up alone on a ridge and why his pregnant wife left no sign at all. By the winter of 2020, the case file was split neatly into 2 columns. Under knowns, Ryan's remains, confirmed. The campsite, confirmed. The SUV, confirmed. A handful of items with provenance. Under unknowns, cause of death, the missing revolver, Melissa's fate, the fate of the unborn child. The imbalance was the heart of the mystery. Theories sprouted in that vacuum. Accident. The simplest story was that Ryan slipped, fell, and died where he landed. Melissa, heavily pregnant, might have gone for help and never made it. But why leave no trace, no bones, no fabric, no gear? Alaska does consume, but it rarely erases. Wildlife, bears, wolves, even moose are capable of killing. But scavenging scatters. Scavenging leaves fragments. Ryan's skeleton had fragments. Melissa's absence had nothing. Predation without residue is a fairy tale, one biologist told the Anchorage Daily News. Human intervention. The missing revolver tilted some minds here. If someone else had been in those hills, hunter, trapper, or stranger, they might have crossed paths. The belt with the empty sheath nagged. If the gun isn't on the ground, it's in a hand, a trooper muttered. But no shell casings, no bullet wounds, no witness. Domestic fracture. Some on the internet speculated Ryan had turned on Melissa, or Melissa on Ryan. Detectives didn't favor it, but the void lets anything breathe. People love a villain, a retired investigator said, but villains leave evidence. Out here, we don't even have footprints. As 2021 began, troopers organized one more concentrated push, funded by a grant aimed at resolving long-term missing cases. They used ground-penetrating radar in likely soil pockets, hoping to catch anomalies that bones or fabric might create beneath the moss. They found Void's collapsed burrows, ice lenses, nothing human. They brought cadaver dogs back in the thaw. The animals worked hard, noses down, tails high, quartering across benches and gullies. Twice they stiffened and barked, once at a tangle of roots, once at a rocky shelf. Both times excavation yielded only deer remains. The handlers shrugged. They told us death is here, one said. They didn't tell us whose. Media attention crested again, then ebbed. Podcasts ran multi-part series. True crime bloggers pieced the story into timelines and red string graphics. Each returned to the same unsolvable hinge. Why only Ryan? Why only half? In Anchorage, Erin grew weary of interviews. It feels like they want me to give them an ending, she said, but I don't have one. She had buried Ryan in July 2020, a closed casket, because the family could not bear to see bones. The marker carried his name and the dates, with an inscription beneath, "Beloved husband, awaiting his wife." Every October, when the leaves in the Talkeetnas turned and the first snow dusted the peaks, volunteers still walked into those valleys. Some did it out of duty, some out of curiosity, some out of hope that chance might tip the balance at last. They carried maps, GPS, water, and sometimes nothing but stubbornness. They always came back with stories of beauty and danger moose crashing through brush, the silence of ridges at dusk, but never with Melissa. The case remains open. The files remain thick, and the wilderness remains silent. 2 years gave back a skeleton. 4 years gave back theories. 6 years have given back only echoes. In the end, the Talkeetna Mountains tell the same story they always tell. People vanish here, and the land keeps its secrets. And somewhere within those secrets, a woman, 7 months pregnant, walking into the trees beside her husband, has never walked out again. The years after Ryan's discovery did not bring clarity. Detectives returned to the ridge each summer, armed with new tools, new dogs, new maps. They revisited old coordinates, hoping thaw or flood might reveal what snow and moss had hidden. Nothing surfaced. By 2022, the search had become less a coordinated effort and more a rhythm of persistence. Volunteers hiked the drainages on their own. Hunters kept eyes open for scraps of fabric. Bush pilots scanned valleys from above. Each season, a few new objects were brought. In an old boot sole, a torn tarp, a strand of hair snagged on alder. Each tested, each dismissed. None belonged to Melissa. The official file thickened with paperwork, but thinned in spirit. Theories filled the void. Some clung to the accident story. Ryan slipped, Melissa tried to save him, and both were claimed by the terrain. But without Melissa's body, it felt incomplete. Others believed wildlife scattered their remains separately. Biologists doubted it. You'd find something, one said. A tooth, a shoe. Wilderness doesn't erase. It only delays discovery. The human intervention theory carried its own momentum. The missing revolver remained a splinter no one could ignore. If Ryan's belt still held its sheath, why not the gun? Had Melissa taken it to defend herself? Had someone else walked away with it? In town, whispers of a third party grew louder each year. Hunters aren't the only ones in those woods, a man told a reporter. You never know who's living off grid. Then there were the darker theories, the ones no family wants to hear. That Ryan and Melissa's story had fractured privately, and the wilderness only finished what had already broken. Detectives found no evidence of it, no history of conflict, no financial motive. Friends rejected the thought. Still, speculation lived where evidence did not. Through it all, Erin kept showing up. She answered every call from troopers, stood in front of cameras when anniversaries came, and asked the same question that never left her lips. Where is my sister? She had buried Ryan in 2020, but Melissa had no grave, no stone, no place to mourn. By 2023, the Carter's disappearance had settled into the catalog of Alaska's enduring mysteries. Like plains swallowed by mountainsides, like hikers who walked out of camp and never walked back, it became a cautionary tale. Podcasters spoke of it as the Talkeetna camping mystery. Hikers whispered about it around fires. To the families, it was not folklore. It was a wound. The last official press release came in the summer of 2024. It listed the knowns and unknowns, almost identical to the list drawn years earlier. It ended with the phrase, "Case remains open. Leads welcome." The words read like ritual, not hope. Now, two names remain at the center of silence. Ryan, found and buried, his cause of death undetermined. Melissa, 7 months pregnant, vanished without a trace. No bones, no clothing, no child who should be 6 years old today. Every October, candles still burn on the porch of Erin's house in Anchorage. Neighbors gather quietly, saying less each year, but staying until the wax pools out and the wicks gutter. On the kitchen table inside sits Melissa's journal, the last page marked with a heart beneath a baby's name. The Talkeetna Mountains have given back half the story and swallowed the rest. And so the theories remain, circling without resolution. Was it the land, merciless and vast? Was it animals? Was it human hands? Or was it something no one has yet considered? The cruelest truth is not just that no one knows. It is that no one may ever know. The silence of those ridges is the only witness left.